This portion of the Salamander Crossing Brigade training is focused on amphibian ecology and conservation, especially as it relates to the spring amphibian migration. We'll talk about the migration, as well as how it fits in with the life cycle of these species, and we'll discuss the ecological role that amphibians play in forested ecosystems and some conservation concerns. Our hope is that you'll leave not only feeling inspired to help provide these animals with safe passage on their migrations, but also to advocate for amphibian conservation in your community. There's a myth environmental educators love to tell, and it goes something like this. After a long, cold, snowy winter, warmer temperatures finally arrive. The snow melts, the ground thaws, and one afternoon it begins to rain. And that rain continues all night long. And on that one big night, all of the spotted salamanders and all of the Jefferson salamanders and all of the wood frogs and all of the spring peepers emerge from the underground burrows where they've spent the winter and migrate across the landscape on one big night to their breeding wetlands. We call this myth Big Night. And while it's true that thousands of amphibians are active on any given migration night, what's more myth than reality is the notion of it happening on one night each year. It's much more common to experience several big nights, a handful of medium nights, and even a smattering of small nights each spring. And the reason for that is because big night all depends on the weather. Every year, I hear from eager Crossing Brigade volunteers who want to know exactly when the amphibian migration will happen so they can be sure not to miss it. I wish that I could give them a date to pencil into their calendars, but it's more complicated than that. Amphibian migrations occur when three factors come together at the same time. The first is thawed ground or minimal snow cover. These animals overwinter underground, so even if above ground conditions are perfect for a migration, they won't get the message that spring is here if there's still a blanket of snow. Early in the season, this is the biggest variable from site to site, as our high elevation sites tend to hold on to snow cover and frozen ground longer than low elevation sites. The second factor is warm nighttime temperatures. Amphibians are ectotherms, or cold-blooded animals, whose body temperatures mirror that of their surroundings, much below 40 degrees, and they simply won't be active. And again, the migration is a nocturnal phenomenon, so it's nighttime temperatures that we're looking for here. The last factor is rain, or wet weather. In some years, if we have an exceptionally dry spring, some amphibians might make their move on humid or foggy nights rather than rainy nights. But your classic big night occurs with 45-degree rains well into the evening after the ground has thawed. In the Monadnock region, these can occur anytime from mid-March through early May. Now we're going to look at how Big Night fits into the larger scheme of things by taking a look at a year in the life of the spotted salamander. This photo was taken on a big night, no doubt, but is a bit misleading as it makes it look like spotted salamanders regularly clamber across snowy ground to get where they're going. In fact, this was probably a small snowbank at the edge of a road. Spotted salamanders, wood frogs, and other amphibians can cross small amounts of snow, but won't move in any great numbers until most of the snow has gone. This is a more typical Big Night photo taken by Dave Huth in upstate New York, and I love this photo because you can see the mud that is caked onto the salamander. This is a salamander who has just emerged from underground. So where are these salamanders going on big nights? In most cases, they're headed to a vernal pool, often the very pool where they themselves hatched out of an egg. Vernal pools are depressions in the forest floor that fill with melting snow and spring rains. In late March, many vernal pools look like this. The thing to keep an eye on is that fallen tree in the middle of the pool here. By mid-April, that pool looks like this. You can see that the water has thawed and also receded quite a bit. That's partially due to evaporation as temperatures warm, and also because as trees start to leaf out, they draw upon groundwater. This is prime time for vernal pools, when amphibians are most active in them. Here's that same pool in late summer. As you can see, the water has completely gone. So why does this matter? This matters because fish cannot survive in vernal pools. And fish eat amphibian eggs and amphibian larvae. So spotted salamanders and other vernal pool amphibians have adapted to breed in sites where they have fewer predators to eat their young. Spotted salamanders, wood frogs, and other vernal pool amphibians can migrate up to a quarter mile on tiny feet to return to their vernal pools each spring. Males are often the first to arrive. When spotted salamanders reach their pool, they perform a courtship dance at night only, known as congressing. It can involve anywhere from 5 salamanders to 500 salamanders swimming and swirling around in the water. The male salamanders then swim to the bottom of the vernal pool and deposit what are called spermatophores, little packets of sperm, on leaf litter or twigs at the bottom of the pool. Each male can deposit several clusters of these spermatophores, which are quite small. They look like breadcrumbs. Female salamanders will then select spermatophores to absorb into their cloaca, which will then fertilize their eggs internally. So although fertilization is internal, the male and the female salamander may or may not have any physical contact with one another. A few days later, the female will lay her eggs, often attached to a twig or leaf or other underwater structure. Those eggs will quickly absorb water and swell in size. They can be clear or milky in color, as you can see here. It is common for female spotted salamanders to deposit their eggs communally in certain sections of the vernal pool. So while a single female salamander may only deposit 1 to 3 egg masses each year, you may find many egg masses grouped together. In this case, this could be from as few as 3 salamanders or as many as 8 or 9. The eggs hatch in 4 to 6 weeks depending on water temperature. Salamander larvae are quite small. This one is gripping on to something called a fingernail clam, which also lives in vernal pools. For a sense of scale, fingernail clams are about half the size of your pinky fingernail. So while they're small, they are voracious predators of mosquito larvae and other invertebrates that live in the vernal pool. They'll exist as larvae for 2 to 3 months. During this time, they will have to grow lungs, grow legs, and get ready for life on land. By late summer or early fall, juvenile spotted salamanders are finally ready to leave their vernal pools and start their new life underground in small mammal burrows. It will be another 2 to 5 years before they reach reproductive maturity. When they do, many of them will return to the very vernal pool where they themselves hatched to court and lay their eggs. Spotted salamanders are long-lived species. They can live upwards of 20 years. So patterns begin to emerge on the landscape where they travel each spring. In many cases, this now means crossing roads to get from the woodlands where they spend most of their lives to the vernal pools where they breed. Now we'll talk a little bit about the ecological significance of amphibians. Of course, every living being has intrinsic value simply by virtue of existing, but amphibians also play an important ecological role in our forested ecosystems. Now, one way of assessing that role is a concept called biomass. In its simplest form, biomass is calculated by adding the mass of an individual in a given species or group of species to the mass of all the other individuals in that species or group. So for instance, if I wanted to calculate the biomass of human beings in the Harris Center, I would add the mass of all the teaching staff and all the land staff and the conservation research staff and maybe all the students who were visiting for a day, and I'd get a number. And maybe I want to compare that number to the biomass of mice or ants in the Harris Center building. Now, mice and ants are much smaller in mass than human beings, but tend to be much more numerous. And so when you ran the numbers, they just might surprise you. So biologists have done just this for a forest in northern New Hampshire, the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, and they found that the biomass of redback salamanders, just that one species, was twice that of all the bird species combined during peak bird breeding season. Now, this study was done in the 70s, and more recent research suggests that they actually may have been underestimating the number of redback salamanders in the forest. So the numbers could actually be even greater than that. Another study in Massachusetts looked at the biomass of vernal pool breeding amphibians, so wood frogs, spotted salamanders, and Jefferson salamanders, and found that it was greater than all of the breeding birds and small mammals combined in the 53-acre forest surrounding a single vernal pool. So what does all of this mean? It means that there is an incredible amount of energy moving through our forests in the bodies of amphibians. And that is most clearly expressed in the food web. So amphibians are important prey for herons and owls and snakes and turtles and foxes and coyotes and turkeys and nearly every vertebrate. They're important prey as adults. They're also important prey as eggs. So we just talked about vernal pools as being relatively free of predators, but there's not no predators in a vernal pool. If you think about what our woods look like in early and mid-April, they're pretty brown. There's not much growing. There's very few buds, flowers, fruits, nuts, flying insects. Animals who have spent the winter waiting for spring are hungry. And so if a Blanding's turtle or raccoon stumbles upon a vernal pool with all of these nuggets of protein just sitting there waiting, they will take advantage of that. Barred owls also commonly hunt for adult amphibians in vernal pools. So vernal pools have likely served as fast food oases for spring wildlife in New England for at least 10,000 years. It is not uncommon for a small vernal pool to produce over 10,000 froglets. If they're lucky, 10 will make it to adulthood. The rest are food. Amphibians are also very important predators, particularly of insects and other invertebrates. So during the growing season, American toads can eat 3 times their body weight in invertebrates every day, up to 10,000 insects a season. And some research at vernal pools found that vernal pools that had salamander larvae had lower populations of mosquito larvae, not only because the salamanders ate the mosquitoes, but because the mosquitoes preferentially selected vernal pools with fewer salamanders in them to lay their eggs. They want their young to survive too. There's also new research that indicates that salamanders may be important with regards to carbon sequestration. In fact, the New York Times called salamanders the climate change heroes of the forest when reporting on this research. The idea is this. In the forest floor, there's a whole group of invertebrates collectively known as shredders. They eat leaf litter, and when they shred it up, a little bit of the carbon in those leaves is released into the atmosphere as gas, one of the climate change gases. If there are fewer shredders and those leaves are not broken down, they are covered by other leaves in kind of a wet blanket, and that carbon gets more slowly absorbed into the soil. So the idea is that when you have more salamanders eating shredders, you have fewer shredders. And when you have fewer shredders, you have more carbon being absorbed into the soil than released into the atmosphere. And there are several studies in which scientists have quantified this. They've given a number for how much carbon per acre is released with salamanders present and without salamanders present. Now, I think this research needs to be replicated in many more places before it's accepted as fact, but it's a really interesting idea. Not only are amphibians important, they're also imperiled in many places throughout the world. They have porous skin, so they're particularly sensitive to pollutants, toxins, and disease. Nearly 50% of all salamander species worldwide are threatened or presumed extinct, and about a third of all frog and toad species as well. This is largely due to habitat loss and disease, but there are other factors as well, which we'll discuss in just a moment. This map dates to 2008 and is in the process of being updated in 2021 and 2022, so we may have more recent data soon. But this shows the number of amphibian species that are threatened or presumed extinct in different parts of the world. So there are places in the world that have more threatened amphibian species than we have altogether in New England. If you look closely at our neck of the woods, you can see that we don't have any colors on the map. We're very fortunate. We have an opportunity to keep our common species common. One area of increasing conservation concern for reptiles and amphibians is roadkill. Now, most of the time when I ask people to think of roadkill and what species comes to mind, they say squirrels or deer or porcupines, species who are hit typically one at a time and whose carcasses remain on the road for days or even weeks, where they're very visible. Very few people think of amphibians, and that's because when amphibians are hit by cars, it tends to be at night. They're small and soft-bodied, so their carcasses are often pulverized beyond recognition very quickly or scavenged by the time morning rolls around by crows or ravens or foxes. So it's a pattern that is largely invisible to us, but growing body of research suggests that it's a grave concern. So here are a few statistics that made my jaw drop. A study in Canada looked at a 2-mile stretch of road over 4 seasons and documented more than 30,000 dead amphibians. A study in New York looked at salamanders attempting to cross a paved rural road and found that the best case scenario was that 1 of every 2 successfully made it across. A study in Massachusetts looked specifically at spotted salamanders, found lower mortality rates than the New York study, but found that even at those lower rates, they were likely to lose their spotted salamander populations due exclusively to road mortality in as few as 25 years. When it comes to reptile and amphibian road mortality, not all roads are created equal. Hotspots occur on sites with wetlands or water bodies within a few hundred feet of the road. Causeways, which are roads that have water on both sides of the road, have 4 times as much amphibian roadkill and 9 times more reptile roadkill than roads not located near water. Traffic volume makes a difference too. Really large interstate highways probably lost their nearby amphibian and reptile populations long ago. And dirt roads with just 1 or 2 houses on them probably don't have enough traffic to make a difference. But paved rural roads and even some unpaved rural roads have just enough vehicles to do a lot of damage. And in fact, it doesn't take very many cars to do a lot of damage. A few nights out on the road on big night will convince you of this. That was the depressing part of this training. Now here's the hopeful part. There are solutions and they work. Amphibian tunnels are being used increasingly throughout the world to create safe passage for amphibians underneath roads. These are photos of wood frogs and spotted salamanders traveling through the famous Henry Street amphibian tunnels in Amherst, Mass. These are one of the first amphibian tunnels to be instituted anywhere in North America and were highly studied. They're quite well known in herpetological circles. Recently, Moncton, Vermont also installed 2 tunnels for amphibian passage. This doesn't look like a very exciting picture, but it actually is quite exciting because it's the first spotted salamander documented using one of those tunnels. In the first season, they documented more than 2,200 amphibians passing through these tunnels. Now, tunnels are very effective when combined with fencing that guides the animals to the tunnels, because they allow passage any time of day or night, whether people are there or not. The downside to tunnels is that they're quite expensive and can take a long time to put into practice. So this Moncton effort took 10 years of planning and fundraising and cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $400,000. Not every community has that kind of time or resources available to devote to amphibian infrastructure. Another solution that is being implemented in a growing number of communities throughout the Northeast, including right here in Keene, New Hampshire, in partnership with our Salamander Crossing Brigade program, is amphibian road closures or detours on big nights. Now, tunnels are the most effective because they're available for amphibians to use at any time, including on small nights or medium nights, or for the outbound migration away from the breeding wetlands that happens in a less concentrated way later in the season. Whereas amphibian road closures are really geared towards the biggest nights, the nights when the highest number of amphibians are likely to be on the road. Because they do provide an inconvenience for drivers, it's not possible to close roads typically for entire seasons, but these are geared towards the nights when the highest number of amphibians are going to be on the road. But as we've observed from many nights on the road, on nights when you've got hundreds of frogs crossing the road, it doesn't take a lot of cars to do a lot of damage, and so road closures like these can make a difference. Now, before you can build amphibian tunnels or talk to communities about closing roads, you have to collect information on where these crossings are taking place, what species are involved, and how many animals are involved. This is vital information for informing and prioritizing these road crossing efforts, and every tunnel and road closure effort started with people going out on big nights and counting amphibians on the roads. That's where the salamander crossing brigades come in. If you're interested in participating in the salamander crossing brigades, be sure to watch our separate slideshows on how the brigades work and how to stay safe on the road on big nights. If you have other questions, check out harriscenter.org, where we've got a ton of information about amphibians and about the crossing brigades. And you're also welcome to write me at thielen@harriscenter.org at any time. Thanks for watching.